Welcome to the Mystic Detectives podcast, where we seek to unlock the wonders of the unknown. I'm one of your hosts, Crystal Miller.
And I'm your other host, Andrea Marziano. Hey, Crystal, how are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am pretty good. My allergies are once again kicking my patukas, but other than that, things are good, and I can see out of my eye that's swollen, so that's good too.
Well, I'm glad you can see out of it.
Really good news. Hey, I wanted to tell you about something fun that the granddaughter and I did yesterday.
Okay, let's hear it.
We went rock hounding with Wes, who was on our gemology
Yeah.
podcast. So that was super fun because out where they live is by part of the Puget Sound Inlet, which comes from the ocean. And they have a place called Dungeness Point.
Hmm.
And we went out there. It's something that used to be a little known secret to people outside of town, but now people know about it. And of course, I just said it, but I don't expect a whole bunch of people to go rushing over there. Anyway, he showed me how to find agates. And
Cool.
it was hilarious because I'm like, "Is this one?" He said, "It's a pretty stone." I'm like, "Oh." And it was. So I probably came out with a lot of pretty stones. And he found an agate for me and showed me because he said, "I want you to have this so you can compare it when you go hunting again so you know what you're looking for." And that was great. And then he also found me a piece of petrified wood, which was really awesome too. And he was saying that it's interesting to watch the things that are coming up onto the shore right now because
Hmm.
some of them are glacial and probably come from Canada.
Oh, wow.
And where we were standing, we could look across the bay and see Canada. So, I mean, it didn't come from billions of miles away, but still it's a long way and across
Yeah.
the ocean. And usually the heavier rocks, the bigger collectible type, don't make it to shore. They're
Right.
usually down in the bottom of the ocean somewhere. So it was fascinating to look at that. And I found some quartz crystals, some cloudy, some clear. And he said, "That's just a quartz." I'm like, "I know." And I
Don't say
collected quite a
just a
bit of
quartz. Come on,
I
Wes.
know. Well, different people have different ideas of what's pretty. And he said that when they first went out there years ago, they used to collect every blasted rock. And now he's like, "We only collect agates now because we have so many rocks." And so I thought that's true. After a person has plenty of something, they stop collecting. And Max would contend that I have too many rocks and that bringing back 2 bags of rocks that aren't even super special were too many rocks. But hey, it's all right. I move them most of the time. Anyway, so that's what we did. And it was fun. Eliza loved it. She was having a good time. She was able to get into the ocean water. What's nice about the sounds are that they have waves, but they're not giant waves.
Right.
So there's an ebb and flow, and the high tide and low tide, and everything else. And but it's something that we can feel comfortable standing in. And I told Eliza she was going to wear jeans. I'm like, first off, it's hot. Secondly, secondly, if you want to get in the waves, pants are a bad idea. And then she was in the waves and she came back and said, "Oma, even shorts didn't cut it today." And I said, "What?" She said, "Well," and she turned around and there was a big water all up her back and down her legs. And well, that's true, but at least they'll dry off faster.
Yeah.
So we had a nice time. We went out there first thing in the morning and didn't even leave until later. And then we stopped at another portside town nearby called Gig Harbor and wandered around. It's one just a little cute portside town. And she was happy to know that we found some ice cream.
Uh-huh.
And she was very excited about that. And she had wanted to know where it was, but was unwilling to ask people on the street. And
Huh.
she said, "You ask Oma." I said, "No, if you want it, you ask." And so she didn't. She didn't. We went into an art store and I was talking with a woman, of course, about rocks. And Eliza was standing there and she said, "So I have a question." And we both thought it might be about rocks. "Where
Uh-huh.
is an ice cream store?" And so we found out it was literally around the corner. So we went and walked up there. It was fun though. It was very hot. And it was a good trip. We got to explore a yacht that somebody was there with. And it
That's
was nice. We saw some jellyfish and all the things. So it was a really good day.
good. I'm glad.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, me too.
I went and had burger and beers with Holly Sue, and it was nice. We just decided to have a leisurely afternoon. And so we went and sat for about 3 hours, just chit chatting with beer and
Nice.
burgers. It was great. It was a
Nice.
nice relaxation.
Yeah, and sometimes that's the best. When we were walking up and down the street, I saw this couple in this, it looked it was just some little pub sort of bar sort of thing, and
Mhm.
there was a big window, a folding window that is closed in the winter, I'm sure, but it
Uh-huh.
was open now, and it was just fun. They were sitting at the bar at the window, and they were talking, and we walked up and down. We came back about 45 minutes later, and they were still sitting there visiting, and I thought, "What a nice day, just to sit there,
Yeah.
sipping a beverage, having a little snack, and just enjoying the time."
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of times we don't take advantage of the moments we could take advantage of and do all the shoulds. Should do
Yeah.
this, should do
Right.
that.
And we didn't know this was one of those bars that prides itself on having lots of beer on draft. And so
Mm,
we were able actually to try some different beers because they probably had a good 25 beers on draft. So we got to try some beers that we'd never tried. Holly and I both prefer draft beer over, bottles or cans.
sure.
And it was just really fun. So good days for both of us, sounds like.
Indeed. And is Oklahoma one of the states that you can take a sample of a beer before you order a whole beer?
Yeah, but you can't take to go beer.
Sure. Yeah,
Like
I think
in
that's
Texas, in
probably
Texas, you can take alcohol to go, but not in
uh,
Oklahoma.
yeah, and during COVID in Washington, there were some establishments that could make to-go cocktails, but they had to be in sealed containers, like a
Y-
can or
Believe it or not,
a
did that in
bag.
Utah for a minute. I don't know if it lasted, but I do remember the Bayou being able to send you home with beer.
Yeah. Basically, get the heck out of our shop. We can't be
Yeah,
near you.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Anyway, we digress to beer conversation on the Mystic Detectives podcast. However, dear listeners, if you've listened more than 4 minutes of our podcast, you'll know this is not uncommon. So it's good stuff. Well, today our podcast is about intuition. And do you have what would you say is the definition of intuition?
um,
Do you have anything that comes to mind?
oh, I would say it's just a feeling or a thought that comes to you that you know somehow to listen to or to act on or to um, remember something like that, maybe.
Mhm, mhm. Well, according to the definition in the dictionary I looked at online, um, intuition is the ability to acquire knowledge without recourse to conscious reasoning or needing an explanation. So, different fields use the word intuition in very different ways, including, but not limited to, direct access to unconscious knowledge, unconscious cognition, gut feelings, inner sensing, inner insight to unconscious pattern recognition, and the ability to understand something instinctively without any need for conscious reasoning. The thing I liked about that definition is inner insight to unconscious pattern recognition. And I thought
Interesting.
about that a little bit, and I thought, what could that mean? And I feel like, and tell me if you agree with this, but I feel like it can be the pattern of if I even walk in a dark place, I can run into people and maybe I don't want to. So
Uh huh.
stay out of dark places.
Uh huh.
So the pattern is dark place can equal people I don't want.
Uh huh.
That was one of the things I was listening or thinking of. Are there any kind of pattern recognitions that you would think of that might be referring to?
It's interesting that you say that about dark places may equal people I don't want because I think that actually that kind of becomes a boundary border because sometimes like I know that I can talk myself into the worst case scenario, in a dark alley, and I'll be scared to death to walk down this alley, but it's all because of the stories I've told myself, not necessarily because I'm feeling intuition about it. But then I can also be in a dark alley and be like, this just doesn't feel right. And there's no
Hmm.
story and there's no anything other than not today. And so um I like that idea that when there is no story, it's that access to the unconscious or the subconscious, right? And
Yeah.
so there doesn't need to be a story because whatever intuition is, whether it's inside of us or outside of us or both,
Hmm.
um, just speaks for itself.
Yeah. And I like that idea is that it's that knowing that isn't based on story. I like that a lot because there are times that where wisdom says, don't do this, don't do that.
Hmm.
You touch your finger to a burning hot thing, you're going to get burned. Well,
Right,
that's wisdom. That may be based on experience, it may not. Now, intuition may or may not come into play with it. However, basic life learning will say, hot, ouch.
right,
That's how
right,
it is.
right.
So maybe intuition may say, I didn't see anyone cooking on the stove, but I just feel like it might be hot. I'll stay away from it. Or that could just be wisdom also,
Yeah,
because again, in our lives, we've been trained stove can mean hot.
right,
Don't touch it.
right,
Seriously.
right.
So it can be that simple. So it's a little bit tricky, I think, sometimes to unravel these pieces. Intuition was defined on another side I looked at as the subtle inner knowing, like a whisper from the universe. That I really liked. A
Yeah,
whisper from the universe. Because it's usually intuition isn't necessarily logical, rational, or even explainable. It it just sometimes people would say it just is. And it will potentially lead us to unexpected insights or unexpected experiences, or we may find later that what we felt was proven to be true. I noticed that with intuition, if something feels wrong and I don't do it, I very rarely know why. I just get to
right,
trust.
right.
And that's a big part of intuition as well, is that trust. So if your examples are, if you're having a job offer, like we said, sensing danger in a dark alley, or feeling a connection to someone you've just met, it may be a form of intuition.
Yeah,
And it may be just the universe whispering something. And
sure.
I feel like there are so many times that intuition comes to play. Now, I was looking at a few different, just started out just Googling intuition, as we all do.
Sure.
It's like, what is? And it's it's got basically the same. It's one of the few things I've actually looked at that the definitions and the reportings and the research indicates pretty much the same thing. And scientists and philosophers have been debating for centuries the origin of intuition and
Mhm.
also the validity of intuition.
Sure, sure.
And guess what? They don't know. They just don't know.
Right, right,
Over all these years, it's because it's not one of those things that's quantifiable. Because if you say every fourth time intuition bears true, it's impossible
right.
because
Well,
it
and
may not. We don't
right,
know.
and there comes into play the prove a negative, right? You can't prove a
Yeah,
negative. So
exactly.
we're saying my intuition said don't do this. I didn't do it, and nothing happened. So yay, I'm safe, right? I mean,
That's right.
prove it, right? Like,
My leg didn't fall off. It must be intuition.
right,
Right, exactly. Which
right,
may or may not have anything to do with the intuition one was receiving.
right.
And so a lot of people look at this as a spiritual force. So
Yep,
when we talk about a whisper from the universe, that to me is more spiritual,
yep,
where there's a reason I'm hearing this message. Some people may look at it as a religious thing. Some
sure.
people may look at it as their guides and their angels talking to them. Nobody seems to really have a clue. And that's okay because I feel like it's one of those things that it really doesn't matter. It's just intuition is there. And I believe it's one of the things that protects us.
Are there people out there, scholars, philosophers, whomever, that are naysayers that actually argue that intuition doesn't exist? Or
Not
is
that
it
I
kind of,
saw.
yeah, I wondered if it was kind of across the board accepted as something, even though we don't know what it is.
Yeah, I feel like the people that I was looking just in general searching more felt like it was basically life lessons we just sort of forgot being taught rather
Mhm.
than something else. If they didn't believe it was from our self, most people who didn't believe it was some whispering from the universe believes it's our hidden messages from our unconscious. So more of a inner learning than an inner knowing,
Mm,
if that makes sense. So I
mhm.
learned this because my mom, my grandma, my great grandma all taught this. Now we
Right.
might not have said it exactly that way. However,
Or they never
that's
said
where
it
it
at
came
all.
from.
We may have observed it, right? We may have
Right.
just unconsciously observed it, and that became a part of our mental and emotional zeitgeist, right?
Exactly. And I always remember this story when something like this comes up of the girl who, when she first got married, cut the ends off her roast and put it in a roast pan.
Uh-huh.
And her husband saw her do it a few times and said, "Why do you do that?" She said, "I don't know. My mom always did." And so she said, "Mom, why do you always do that?" She said, "I don't know. My mom always did." And she called her mom and she said, "Mom, why did you do that?" She said, "Because my roast pan was too small."
Yeah, exactly.
And
Exactly.
so that was a subconscious thing. They did it because they saw it, but they didn't know why.
Yeah.
And the real
Well,
reason was hysterical to me. That's like, oh, well, that's silly.
I actually have a similar story to that, and that is, my mom is not a culinary genius. I love you, mom, if you're listening. Um, and we would make Sunday roast every day, every day.
Mhm. Every day, every Sunday,
Oh gosh,
maybe.
we'd make Sunday roast every Sunday, and we'd put it in the oven. We'd go to church, and we'd come back, and we'd have our roast beef dinner. And she taught us to flour the roast, just pat it
Hmm.
with flour, and then cook it or sear it on the stove. And so she never gave us an explanation. She never really showed us beyond. I mean, she may have shown us once, or I was probably 7. I don't know. But anyway, I just remember I knew that you patted flour on the roast and then you seared it. And as a youngster, often I would skip the searing or I'd half-ass the searing. There are times I would throw flour into the pan and just roll the roast in it, put it in, right?
Hmm.
And of course, it wasn't until, really honestly, my kids got into cooking and into uh, more heavily culinary stuff than just making dinner. And I'd watch shows with them and stuff and found out about how you really do, how you really prepare a roast, which is way more about sealing the outside
Hmm.
so that the juices stay inside.
Right.
And you know our roasts were always dry. They were awful because none of us was doing the actual mechanic that we've been allegedly taught, right? But nobody was actually doing it correctly. And so we'd have these terrible dry roasts. But I did make some damn good gravy from the drippings.
I bet you did.
My family will acknowledge that I'm the best gravy maker in our family. So,
That seems fair. I think that sounds good. So one of the things that I was reading is that in mathematics, intuition can be a blessing and a curse.
hmm mm,
And one of the things that I noticed in some of the things I was looking at is that mathematics or mathematicians often use their gut to kind of follow a trail of
uh-huh,
math sequencing
uh-huh.
and problem solving and that kind of thing. And they'll get to the correct answer. Now, we often say we're not professionals on these things. I am definitely not a professional mathematician. So
Me neither.
I may be saying something that's completely inaccurate. However, as they solve these questions and get a result, in math, it gets to be provable and reproducible.
Mhm.
So they were saying that if a mathematician were to only lean on instinct or gut feeling, well, it probably wouldn't work
Right,
because it probably can't be proven over and over again if it was based on
right,
just an instinct.
right,
However, this seems to me that it's more of an educated guess rather than an instinct. Does that seem
right.
like that to you, or does it seem different?
Yeah, no, I agree. It kind of reminds me of, ninth grade geometry. Show your work, right? How did you get to this? How did you get to this? And
I don't
eh,
know.
I know, right? I'm like, I in my head, okay. But yeah, so I agree. And and you can take that also into medicine, right? I one of the first things I learned in nursing school, which was astounding to me, was that doctors don't diagnose people. Actually, in actuality, doctors don't diagnose people. They eliminate everything that you don't have,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes they do have to go on a gut check, like to maybe run a lab test that might not necessarily be truly indicated or whatever. So what I'm saying is, for doctors, it can also be an educated guess, but it can also be truly like a gut feeling or an intuition. And again, that could go back to, it's just something that they forgot they knew, right? Who knows?
Mhm.
But anyway, I don't know if that made any sense or if that was just
Well,
like,
it it did to me, maybe because I've known you for a long time. Also, however, we'll find out when we one of the things it reminds me of though, as a nurse, is how many times have you been involved with or heard a story about a nurse who had a patient with completely normal vital signs, but they just knew they were going to crash. They
hmm,
just knew.
yep,
There
yep,
was no outward indicator, there was no even mechanism to show that
right,
this was going to happen. They
right,
just knew.
hmm,
And they were right.
right,
And if they knew and prepared, they were ready for it. And if not, they became ready.
yeah,
But it's been so many times that either myself, when I've had a person coming out of surgery who had issues that looked on paper like there was no problem, but all of a sudden something shifted.
hmm,
And just knowing
hmm,
that was the case
hmm,
is something that can literally in this case save a life, and
right,
whether it's a medical thing or something else. So when when we have these moments of intuition, we make a choice in that moment, I think, to either trust it or not trust it, right?
hmm,
We
yep,
can either lean into the hunches or we can question them. Now, I think there's times that questioning them makes sense, where if it just seems completely, what? That doesn't even track to the scenario,
hmm,
then maybe say, okay, like you said earlier, is this a story that's coming up? Or is this
right,
really an actual intuition, feeling, prompt, whatever it is? And sometimes people who develop some of the most amazing things, like, oh, I don't know, they recognized electricity. People told Thomas
right,
Edison that this was insane,
yeah,
that thought he could capture
harness, right,
electricity and
right,
make light,
right,
and
right,
other sorts of things. And he said, no, I just know it's a thing. And he may not have been able to explain completely why, but people were saying it's impossible, you're crazy, things like that. But that's an example of someone saying, I just know, and I'm going to prove it. In this case, it was provable. Sometimes it's not. I
hmm,
had a story, I believe I might have mentioned in a different episode, but it really affected me a lot where I had a patient I was going into his appointment. You might remember this story,
hmm,
and I walked into the room and I just felt this really dark energy. And listeners, if you've heard the story, I apologize. I know not everyone listens to these in order or even all of them. So I'll still repeat it because it was a very strong intuition moment for me. And I just thought, I have to leave. Don't know why, but I have to leave. And I went out to get my doctor, who was, well, not my doctor, the patient's doctor, but my friend who was a doctor. And
right,
I said, I can't go in there by myself. There's something dark about this guy. And the doctor and I had worked together for 12, 15 years. And he said, you've never said that in all these years. And I said, please walk in with me and have a reason for me to walk out with you.
hmm.
And okay. And I wanted to hang on to his arm. I didn't want to go back in. And so we went in and I contained myself. I didn't hang on to him or hold his hand or anything like that. That would have been super professional. But we walked in there and we were talking, and the man in there said that he had been in prison for sexual offense against women. And
Mm,
I know that my spirit felt that dark energy had. Now, do I think I would have been assaulted in the room? Probably not,
right,
because he knew someone else would be coming in. So that would be really dumb. But then he had been in prison. So it's not like people who in prison are always genius people. but
yeah,
but even still, even if it didn't cause me harm in that moment, I honored my intuition and I said, okay, well, I don't know why. I may not be able to ever figure out why, but right now this doesn't feel good. So I'm
yeah.
leaving.
I had a similar instance actually in the same sort of job. So Andrea and I both did field case management for workers' comp injuries, which is where you go to the doctor with your patients to kind of help them get the best care they need and etc. And I had a patient I was assigned to, and I went to their house and I pulled up and I was like, I do not want to go into that house. And I was like, but I got to do my job, and the patient deserves their nurse.
Mhm.
So I did go in, and it was an intake. Obviously, I shouldn't say that's obvious, but it was an intake because I'd never been to the house before. And I went in, and I remember the guy had a living room, and then he had a kitchen behind the living room, and he was asking me to come all the way back into the kitchen. And I was like, I'd rather just stay here in the living room, right? And it takes pretty long. It takes about between 45 minutes and an hour and a half. And so I got the intake done. He offered me coffee, he offered me stuff. I just didn't feel good about any of it. And when I left, I immediately called my manager and I was like, I don't think I can handle this case, and explained to her why. She gave it to a more experienced field case manager, nurse case manager, and who was fine, by the way. But it did end up that this patient, near the end of his treatment, I guess, like killed somebody and had to go to prison. Like, it wasn't her, it wasn't our nurse case manager, it wasn't me,
That's good.
but it was
That's
just
good.
like, it was just like, what? Right? And
Yeah.
I really strongly believe that that the right answer was sending the more experienced nurse case manager, just because well, she was fine with it. First of all, I mean, I told her how I was feeling and she was fine with it. But um yeah, I mean, obviously she was safe, and it was just so weird. It was so weird.
Mhm.
But
Well, and
like
one of
this,
the things too is people who are predators can feel insecurity.
yeah,
And his intuition probably told him that you were an insecure person and easily malleable or
yeah,
potentially
or stuff,
easily.
yeah, probably.
And with her, she's like, I've seen it all.
Right.
So
Right.
just sit down, change the dressing, let's get on with things.
Yeah.
And he knew that she wasn't feeling insecure about anything.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things that predators often look for, is that insecurity or inexperience or ability to be told something different than what is really the case.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, as I was looking for all of this, I was reading for some stories online to see if there were stories, like famous stories about intuition. And I found something on BuzzFeed, and you can take that for as realistic or reliable a source as you want. But these things make a difference, I think. They didn't mention names, so these could be general sort of wives' tales too. But I've heard many stories like them, so I feel like I wanted to bring them forward anyway. There was one that said, I used to work in TV news and had to go into work at 6 a.m. on Saturdays. I don't have my own parking where I live, so I had to walk to my car a block away. While I was walking, I suddenly got this feeling like someone was watching me. I looked to my right across the street and noticed a tall man walking suddenly disappear behind a tree. I stopped and waited to see if he'd continue moving, but he didn't. Then I saw his head popped out and he looked right at me. She said, I have two options: turn around and go back to my apartment or to run to my car. They were the same distance, so I decided to book it to my car. I didn't want this man to know where I lived. Then when I made it to my car, I immediately locked the doors and looked out my driver's side window. There he was staring at me within feet of my car. I called the police. About a week later, he was arrested for
Blah.
robbing a man on the same street.
Yikes.
Yes, and there was no indication of who this person was. However, I'm sure if this story particularly wasn't true, there's probably something much like it. And the second story I read said, I was taking my little cousin's ice skating around Christmas. I was young and in college, so I didn't feel like a very experienced driver yet. I was at a light and about to make a left turn, but something told me not to pull all the way out, even though the light was green. On instinct, I glanced to my left. This huge SUV barreled through the red light. If I had trusted the light instead of my gut, that car would have plowed into my back seat where three children under 10 years old were sitting.
Wow.
That's intense. Can you imagine? That made an impact, I'm sure, on that individual.
Yeah.
Um, And the final one I saw here was when I was 11. I was reading a book one night when I got a horrible feeling. I felt like I was going to be sick. My stomach and my chest hurt. My grandma popped into my head. I was super close with her my whole life, and we had the strange bond that we knew something when something was wrong with each other. I ran out of my room and told my mom I had a bad feeling about grandma, but she was on the phone. Mom hung up and looked at me. She was pale. She had just gotten a call from my aunt who was playing bingo with my grandma. My aunt told my mom she'd call 911 because she thought grandma might have had a heart attack.
Wow.
So it goes on to say, we hurried to the hospital. My grandma was stable when we got there, but she'd been transferred to a larger hospital since no cardiologist was in the smaller emergency room. The paramedics loaded grandma into the ambulance and told my mom if she wanted to keep up, put her hazards on and follow them. So it was a 15-minute trip, and my mom didn't keep her hazards on, just casually followed behind. We were cruising along, and an icky feeling came over me. I told my mom she needed to speed up. She told me no. I told her something bad was happening with grandma and she needed to go faster. She told me grandma was in good hands and was okay. I started crying and begged her to speed up. She agreed. She agreed. Just as she got up close to the ambulance, the sirens came on and they sped up. We caught a glimpse of the paramedics in the back with grandma. They were performing CPR. She had had a massive heart attack in the ambulance and at that moment had flatlined. We were both in tears, keeping up with them, all watching through the little window in the back. Grandma had an open heart surgery emergently that night. She made a quick recovery and had lived much longer than they expected. Can you imagine that? I mean, so much of it,
Yeah.
so much of it.
No.
And to be able to see the CPR going on in the back window and not be
Yeah.
able to do anything.
Yeah. It's
No,
funny.
thank you.
I've had a kid transported 50 miles away to a hospital in an ambulance, and they said the opposite to me. They said, "Don't try to follow us. You'll get arrested. You'll get a speeding ticket. Just get there when you
Yeah,
get there."
yeah,
So that's
exactly.
interesting. Also, that they. I mean, who knows? Maybe that was intuition as well. That they said, "Put your hazards on and keep up." Um,
Yeah, it
because
could be. And there's a lot of times, I mean, I can't think of anybody I know of that I haven't shared some sort of story like this with. And
mhm,
my my brother, I may have mentioned this story too, had been when the Nimitz Freeway in 1989 fell in California.
mhm,
My brother had been in the Coast Guard on an active duty weekend,
mhm,
and he was about to go across the bridge, but decided he would just stop and get something to eat because he was hungry.
uh-huh.
And he did, and he was sitting there and he watched the bridge collapse. He would have been on the bridge.
My dad has a similar story to that. And my dad can be a teller of tales, but
Mhm,
I was able to verify this with facts. I wish I could find my source, but I haven't looked it up in so long. But
mhm,
he was driving between Arizona and Marin County, California, and he was on, I think it was the I-5, might have been,
mhm,
I can't remember, but on a freeway that was going to Arizona. I don't know what it was. And it was late at night, and he noticed this guy kept pulling up next to him and then just looking at him. And then my dad would slow down or speed up, just try to not be paced. And guy would pull up and look at him, just stare at him. And so the next exit, my dad was like this, and just pulled off the exit. And the guy kept going, and decided to just take a little nap off the exit. Just it was night. He was a little sleepy. Why not? Right? That guy let that guy get way further ahead.
mhm.
Anyway, when he woke up in his car a few hours later, uh, there were police cars and ambulances everywhere, and turned out that this guy that he had seen was in fact pulling up to cars on the freeway and um, shooting the person they're next to in their car. And I think he
Wow.
shot like 6 people. And like my dad, for whatever reason, was just like, "Nah, I'm not going to play with this." Right? Like
Mhm,
rather than continuing to, I guess, play that pacing game, he just like noped out. He was just like, "Peace, see you later. You go do your thing, weirdo." And it like
mhm.
literally saved his life. Craziness.
And that can happen so many times. We've heard stories, I'm sure you've heard as many as I have about September 11th, where
Hmm.
just a small stopping point kept
Yep.
someone from being in the towers. Now,
Yep.
some people would say, well, because they lived right and things like that. And I don't think it has anything to do with that. I think it's a
Yeah.
matter of listening to their intuition, taking a moment and checking in. And we've had a lot of people on our various podcasts with different kinds of gifts and skills. And every single one of them I can think of has said, take time to check in.
Right.
Whether they say those words exactly or not, they don't all, but that's the message, is make sure you know where your energy is, where your
Hmm.
emotions are, where your spirituality is and things like that, and check in and really listen to those times. I know that this morning I was telling Eliza what the podcast was about, and I said intuition, and she said, well, what's that? And so we talked about it. And then she said, wait, my dad had something like that. And I said, really, what was it? And they had gone to a restaurant somewhere and they were going to get, they don't go out to eat very often, but she
Hmm.
said they had gone to this one restaurant and I think they were going to get something super healthy like donuts. And she said they walked in and Craig just felt uncomfortable and said, we can't go in. We just can't
Huh.
go in. And so they turned around and left. And I said, well, do you know why, or did something happen? And she said, no, we don't know why, but he felt that way and we left. And I feel like that happens all of the time. And and it can be a little teeny thing, it can be a big thing.
Hmm.
There are so many stories, hundreds and hundreds of them. And one of the things is, how do we know whether something intuition or just, yeah, I don't feel like that? I mean,
Right.
how do we know? Well, I know there are a lot of different things that we can follow, and I found something in an article that was from bustle.com, and I don't have any association with this article at all. I don't know if this is a respectable or reliable source, but I liked what they said. And they did reiterate the fact that intuition is basically sort of a feeling or even a sneaky suspicion that something is not right, but you
Hmm.
can't put your finger on why. And there was a licensed psychologist interviewed in the Sarah Schwartz. I am probably saying that altogether wrong, but she said that intuition can be a powerful guiding force and is more developed for some than others. Some people feel a strong urge or sense in their core when something is wrong, while others with a less developed intuition might feel a small inkling that they aren't really sure how to interpret. So, listening to our gut, a lot of people call it air quotes,
Hmm.
or listening to our intuition is is so vital and important. It's something that has been in the human species and potentially other species that we just don't know because they haven't been able to tell us.
Hmm.
But it's been in forever,
Right.
and as I said earlier, it's been studied by everyone, and no one really knows. But a lot of the listening to intuition has a lot to do with trust.
Hmm.
Now, this is trust really in ourselves,
Right.
because if I can't trust myself to make good decisions, then I probably can't trust these little feelings or even the big feelings when they come,
Hmm.
because I just can't trust myself.
Hmm.
And when we're in a state of fear, it's hard to trust ourselves. Like we were talking about that alley or the dark space, and I was thinking alley when I said it. I might be afraid because I listen to murder podcasts. I know everybody get killed in an alley. Nobody walked out
Right.
alive. And that's
Right.
so
There
not
is no
true. But
alley that is safe in the
no alley
world.
ever in the history of the world has been safe, which of course is so not true. And people live with back doors to an alley, and different alleys look different. And so
Hmm.
obviously that's
Hmm.
not true. But in my head, my fear says, nope, 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 alleys are bad.
Right.
And that can be true for people with different things. I mean, I know that you're not comfortable at heights.
Right.
And I was walking with a friend's daughter the other day, and she said, you know, I have a fear of heights. And I said, I know people like that. And I said, take your time, do what you need to come down, because we were just walking downstairs,
Uh-huh.
and she was uncomfortable with that. And I said, it's okay, just take your time. But so in that time frame, a person's in fear. So it's harder to trust your intuition if you're already afraid, because that's where I would think, for me, I would go into the story of, why am
Yeah.
I scared? Well,
Yeah.
because everybody dies in an alley. And
Right.
for you,
E
everybody dies when they're above 4
right.
feet. It just
It
happens.
exactly, and any great is gonna fail. Anything
Yeah,
that I have to
exactly.
step on that has holes is gonna fail
Every single time.
every single
And
time.
and our brains know that's not true.
Right.
And but still, so in those moments it's difficult to trust our intuition. And that's one of the things why it's good if a person wants to be able to be more clear about whether this is intuition or fear, really, because a lot of times those are the main differences.
Yeah.
It's an intuition telling me something, or it's a fear telling me something. Now,
Right.
sometimes I do get that they could overlap, because I
Sure.
might be in a situation that could be scary. However, I feel okay with it. Like that nurse
Mhm.
you were saying about, she
Right.
was in a situation that you felt was scary. It turned out it could have been scary, but
Right.
she was okay in it, maybe because she was armed with different skills,
Right.
or just whatever. It doesn't matter. But how how do you think we can trust our gut, or learn to trust our gut, in a situation where we do get to follow our intuition?
Practice, I guess, you know? I mean, um, I think that there could possibly be some self-reflection and, am I telling myself a story? Is there a story here? Or because I feel like that's kind of the hallmark of intuition, is that it doesn't give you a reason, right? Intuition is just stop or go or send your kid a text or, you know, pull over or
Mhm.
whatever the case may be, right? Don't stop and help that vehicle. Do stop and help that vehicle. But there's no I mean, I really do think that that's the hallmark. There's no story, there's no reason. It's just, I hate to call it, well, no, I don't. It's just an instruction from your self, your higher being, your spirit, the Holy Ghost, whatever you want to call it. There's, it- it's just do, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like that's very true. Also, I happen to have 14 ways that a person could improve their intuition and know how to tell whether it's intuition or not. And one of the things you're talking about is, talked about a little bit during this. This is from the same article from Bustle.
Okay, great.
And so it's there there are just a few people that are cited in it, but it's the article is 14 signs your intuition is talking to you and how to listen, from
Cool.
bustle.com.
Thanks.
So, one of the things they mention is that you notice a tight feeling in your chest or stomach.
Hmm.
And and not everyone has a physical response to this, but some gut instinct feelings are physically noticed.
Hmm.
They might, if it's an intuition about something good, like, oh, should I marry Prince Charming? And you
Right.
feel good about it. Well, maybe that's your intuition saying, sure, that sounds fine, or at least it doesn't sound bad.
Right.
And some people will notice that their gut is trying to communicate something by indicating a sinking feeling. By People will feel that sort of feeling,
Hmm.
and they'll feel a heaviness or something. And that's when it's more on the other side. Don't do this. This says
Right.
stay away,
Right.
stop, something like that. And if it's something that's a positive thing, sometimes it can feel like butterflies, or, like I say, excitement. And that's what people report more often than not, if they've had these feelings of intuition, whether it's on the go or not go side, as you
Uh-huh.
said earlier. The other thing is, if it's a decision that doesn't seem rational, and you feel confident and happy, even if it doesn't seem rational, that's probably you following your intuition,
Right.
because there's that calmness and that peace. And where something like, I mean, I, a few years ago, quit a job that didn't work for me.
Hmm.
And even though it didn't make fiscal sense,
Hmm.
it worked for me,
I
because
still don't forgive you. Just kidding.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Just kidding.
And that's one of those things that made sense to me emotionally in the moment. And
Mhm,
it truly was based on emotion more than
mhm,
anything else. There were
mhm.
some other issues, but mostly it was just how I felt about things.
Right.
And I knew that if I were to write down the pros and cons, it would not have supported what I did.
Mhm.
However, my life supported what I did.
Right.
And I can point every day to a reason why it's better now.
Right.
So, another thing is when following one's intuition, a person might feel hyper aware.
Mhm.
So, say you decide to walk down that alley because your intuition is telling you okay. Well, you still may be hyper aware of your environment because your senses are still speaking. They're still speaking to you.
Mhm.
Even though your intuition says you're okay, you can still be hyper aware, like your sense of smell, sound, sight, and so on. So when we pay attention to these clues, you can realize your intuition is telling you something. Now, you may have felt okay walking into the alley, but you still get to be aware, right? So
Right.
it's still your intuition is leading you, okay, go, and pay attention at the same time. Now, things could change. You might think that something was okay and then something changes, but because
Sure.
you're aware, then you're able to react. And it may be moving something, some reaction or response to the forefront of your brain. And then one thing that the number four thing they said is that the same opportunity keeps knocking on your door. So, hello, hello, I'm here, I'm here.
Right.
And someone, let's see, it was Jill McFadden said she's MSIR comma ACC. I don't know what those wonderful letters stand for, but it's some training, it seems. She is a career coach. But she said, the way I knew that my intuition was trying to talk to me was in hindsight. Opportunity kept knocking on my shoulder, and finally I noticed. And she said, sometimes regretfully, it took years. But when your intuition's trying to communicate with you, it might get your attention by some little patterns through your life, like we talked about before. Maybe there's a pattern of this, maybe there's a pattern of that. And so maybe someone's been wanting a new job, but they were afraid to step out. They kept feeling like their intuition kept saying, hey, you want a new job? Well, look here, look there, do this, do that. And maybe a person doesn't, but then finally does, and like, oh, I guess I was getting that message for a long time.
Right. Right.
However, I didn't listen. And so sometimes we know the result of listening or not listening, and other times we don't, like we said. Um, and then one of the things that I think a lot of people have experienced is that you may notice your thoughts are being pulled in a certain direction.
Uh-huh.
And our intuition, if it's really intuition, does not guide us incorrectly. Whether it is spirit's subconscious, universe, whatever,
Mhm.
intuition is not something that says, jump off this wall, you'll be fine.
Right.
And you're not.
Right. Right.
Intuition is something saying, this circumstance is safe, or if you stop now, whatever. Or like that story before where the person looked to the left, where all signs indicated she was okay to go. But intuition says, look to the left. Okay. So that thought was pulled in that direction. That individual
Mhm.
looked, and it saved their lives, probably, or at
Mhm.
least trial and tribulation. And and so it's something that might your mind might go back and forth to it. One of the things that came to my mind during this was when we've talked about numerology and numbers that get recurring in our lives.
Uh-huh.
And and I wondered if this comes into that, because if a person believes in numerology or angel numbers or things like that, there are messages in these numbers. So I wonder if seeing these patterns is really part of our intuition or our subconscious telling us a message.
Right.
And it falls into the same category for me because also universe, everything else. Um, is kind of along that line. And one of
Yeah.
the things that I think is important to remember that if our thoughts, even if they're repeated, are pulling ourselves into a direction that is not healthy or safe,
Uh-huh.
then that needs to be addressed differently. Because as I just mentioned, it may be resulting from something else like anxiety or mental health concern, or even a situation that maybe a person's gotten used to but is still dangerous.
Hmm.
And our mind is saying, listen, pay attention, do this, do
Hmm.
that. And so it is something to pay attention to on either side. And like I mentioned, and everything I looked at is intuition does not lead us into difficulty.
Right.
It does everything in it, air quote, power to keep us safe and
Right.
healthy and happy.
It
So,
works in our best interest.
right. So if you're feeling something other than that, or repeated thoughts that are detrimental or dangerous to yourself or others, then that's something that may be a mental health concern and needs evaluation along that line. So,
And once again, we are
one
not giving
thing,
medical advice.
again, not giving medical advice, that's right. So, sometimes in this article, it said that you may notice your instinct and intuition are not in sync. And so sometimes your ego will try to do things to protect you from making a mistake or looking silly. And sometimes our instinct may say, well, it's okay. And so where do we find that balance? Did you have something you were going to say?
I probably shouldn't say it. I'll say it, and then Justin can take it out if he wants. But like, we have a very glaring, in my opinion, this is my personal opinion, does not necessarily represent the opinions of mystic detectives, in our president, whose ego will not let him step down and let somebody else run in his place in the Democratic Party.
Mhm.
And there's a lot at stake. And it's funny that you said that, because I've been thinking a lot about just the ego of it all.
Mhm. Yeah, and ego and instinct will have a different place.
Hmm.
And instinct and intuition are different. So instincts are automatic responses, and it can have to do with survival.
Hmm.
Ego is probably also an automatic response, and that's more in survival of the way we look good or the way we approach things, not necessarily literal survival. And
Right.
so it may be an instinct or an ego. I was listening to a story the other day in a podcast, and it said that this person had just married someone and they noticed that they seemed to be dangerous, but they didn't want to leave the relationship because their ego said, I'll look stupid.
Yeah.
And their intuition and maybe even some of their instinct said, I got to get out of here. But they stayed in it and nearly got killed
Uh-huh.
because I guess it was a murder podcast. Anyway, they did not listen because their ego said, I can't do that. I'll look stupid.
I had an experience like that, you may remember. I was in a literal medical emergency in my car, with my daughter, and I was driving, and I had to pull over, and I'd pulled over
Mhm.
into a gas station parking lot, and um, I was in SVT, which, just layman's terms, my heart rate was 300 beats per minute, so it was not great. Um, and I was, starting to feel nauseated. And anyway, long story short, um, I was thinking, like, I don't want to call 911 because it's going to be so embarrassing to have an ambulance come to this parking lot.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's like, and it wasn't until after I had been treated and released, that I was like, my ego literally said, I would rather die than be embarrassed by an ambulance. Like, literally.
Right. Totally
And
makes sense, right?
yeah, exactly. And it's like, and that's the sort of thing, right, where um I finally had to be like, I did have to set aside the ego, because I'm a nurse, for Christ's sake, and say to my daughter, okay, you do need to call 911, like, yeah, absolutely. And she did, and
Mhm.
guess what? I survived, literally and emotionally and socially. Like, I'm still here, everything's okay. Nobody at that
Yeah.
gas station remembers me, I promise.
Right, right. And even if they do, they're probably thinking, "Wow, it's a good thing she called 911 and didn't
Yeah,
die in our
I hope
parking
she's
lot," you know?
okay. Yeah, right,
We
right.
don't want that to
Exactly.
happen.
Exactly.
Exactly. Exactly, and that's important, and that's one of those things that to be able to, as we talked about, to practice and listen to these feelings and these inklings or however a person wants to call them is really important.
Mhm.
And if the intuition is being followed, it almost always has a positive feeling. And if you say, no, no, that's just you get a physical, often a physical going, ooh, ooh, yuck, stomach pain, chest pain, whatever.
Mhm.
And that's somehow our body saying, you're still not listening.
Yeah, you need
So
to
I
listen.
get to
Right.
listen, right? And you may actually feel sick. Some people look at symptoms of anxiety as people not able to hear their intuition.
Hmm.
And I didn't look into that much because I didn't want it to go to a whole different type of
Sure.
podcast. But
Sure.
some people think that that can be related. And also, our body can, they think our body can manifest English, illness, pardon me, illness, an extreme way of letting us know we need to make some kind of change in our life. And I know that my body did that. And
Hmm.
I am 100% convinced that I'm going to practice my English. And sorry, listeners. Um, and I am convinced that some of the medical challenges I've had is because I didn't listen to my intuition to say,
Hmm.
do this or take care of that or whatever. And
Hmm.
I waited until I had a major emergency to go,
Hmm.
guess I should have done X, Y, or Z. So
Hmm.
that's important. And also a lot of times intuition that we're not following, that like the woman I spoke of earlier said she kept getting these feelings and intuition, it'll keep coming up
Hmm.
because our whatever we want to call it is saying, really, listen, here's the thing, this is what you get to listen to. It keeps
Hmm.
coming up. And sometimes it's a major deal, sometimes it's a little deal, but when we listen to our intuition, when we've practiced and know it's intuition, not ego or something else, our life will typically get easier,
Right.
and or at least it won't go poorly. I had a class I was supposed to go to, and I know I've mentioned this in other podcasts, but I kept feeling like I shouldn't go, I shouldn't go, I shouldn't go. I didn't want to go because it was cold
Hmm.
and snowy and everything and terrible out, and I didn't
Hmm.
want to go, but I'm like, no, I'm just being a wimp. And I got on the road, got to the very last place I could turn around, and I just felt like I ran into a brick wall, which I did not physically, but I'm like, okay, okay. So I turned around, went back to bed, woke up to the clock radio back in the dark ages, and said there had been a 52 car pileup on that intersection. And I would
Hmm.
surely have been right in the middle of it. And so, did it save my life? Maybe, but at least
Right.
saved me a lot of stress and strain of trying to get a new car and finish a nursing program and not having any money. So,
Yeah.
in that case, I felt like I knew what the intuition was about.
Hmm.
Most cases, if I've had an intuition to do or not do, I have no idea, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that
Hmm.
because I had a very clear circumstance where it would have been a very hard lesson. And there have
Hmm.
been other times I've had hard lessons that I'm like, well, I see back later in hindsight, as that woman said earlier, that this is one of the reasons why. Some
Yeah.
people in intuition moments actually might have vivid dreams. They'll wake up with a dream. I think
Hmm.
you saw in one of our friend groups that I posted something that I had a dream about a friend of ours who was healthy and went out and did something, and she's having some health concerns.
Hmm.
And her husband said, I hope that's a prophetic dream. And maybe
Right.
it is. Can we have intuition for others? I'm not sure, but that's what I felt.
Yeah.
And it was just a really vivid dream, and I rarely remember my dreams.
Hmm.
And I listened to a podcast recently, This Podcast Will Kill You, which is a
Hmm.
scientific based podcast I've told
Hmm.
you about. And they were talking about dreams, and they were saying how often we have dreams through the night, even though very rarely we remember them.
Hmm.
And they said if you knew how many dreams you had every night, you'd be surprised that you don't remember them. But it's just
Uh-huh.
our, basically, they said it's like clearing the drawers of memory. Yep, here's one. Nope, we don't need this anymore, Chuck, and stuff
Right.
like that. But in the ones that we remember, they said you might want to take note of them because maybe there's something you get to consider. And so I thought that was fascinating that I remembered that one after hearing it a couple of weeks ago.
Hmm.
And one of the things that this article was talking about, this is the 13th point. I've gone through the others, I just haven't numbered them. But it said you'd find clarity when you're not busy. Like they said, have you ever had those aha moments when you're in the shower or driving the car? That's
Hmm.
an example of your intuition trying to talk to you. And
Hmm.
when you allow your mind to rest, as I said, like in meditation or dreams, your mind can open and allow the thoughts to flow through. And that's when your intuition can try to talk to you more,
Mhm.
because your brain and your mind is resting. And so it's more open to those things, which is what they also alluded to in the dream sequence at on that this podcast will kill you. So I really liked that they had spoken of that relaxed state and letting those thoughts that you do remember, just considering maybe it's a message you get to pay attention to.
Right.
So one of the final thing that they said is you find yourself pausing mentally. And this can be very hard, especially in our environments now, right? Where
Right.
everything is instant. Oh my gosh. I was talking about our granddaughter to start, and she's been self-entertaining had been 45 minutes, and she's like, what do I do now? And
Right.
and I feel like more and more over the years, people have been attuned to that instant gratification, paying attention for 3 seconds and then it's over.
Mhm.
And back in the olden days when I was a kid, we had we were sent outside to create a life. I mean,
Yeah, truly,
bye, see you
truly.
later. Come back at dinner time, and if you find dinner first, then stay out till I call you. But
Don't
we
get caught
just
shoplifting, you little
no,
bastards.
that's right. But other than that, just try to stay alive. And that's what we did. But we had to use our imagination. We had to fill that time, and we had a lot of pauses and quiet time where we could go, oh, this is what birds sound like. And I intentionally go out almost every day and just listen. And and I love
It's
that.
funny because we have that goal app that we started using,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
one of my goals is actually just take a step outside. Like,
Right.
step outside of the house, and not like put your foot on the porch and pull it back in, but like take a step outside, you know. And often I leave the house and I count that, right? It's not like but there are some days that, because of work and whatever, I do not get out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just this, it's a fun reminder because this app is fun, but it's a good reminder that I can take even 2 minutes and just step outside,
Yeah.
right? That's
And
it.
And for me, we've talked about grounding on our other episodes. And to me, that's grounding time. Just
Hmm.
stepping outside and going, okay, look, wow. And I live in a lovely, beautiful forested area. So I have a lot of stuff that I can look at and say, oh, there's a frog over there, or I hear a
Hmm.
pond gurgling, or a stream running. And so I have a lot of stuff around here that brings me to nature more than if I lived in the middle of New York.
Sure.
um, but there's still stuff out there. There's still
Hmm.
being outside. There's something to be about with other people and other energies moving around.
Hmm.
And that can be a good thing, and that can be a difficult thing. And so we get your mind to pause, whatever that looks like for us,
Right.
because it can be different for different people. It can simply be a moment of inner reflection. Some people like to write in a journal. I find writing in a journal stressful because
Right.
I'm never doing it right.
Me too.
And we've talked about you with meditation, finding kind of the same feeling with
Right.
meditation, at least in history. And it's like, well, if I don't feel like I'm going to do it right, that doesn't help me. So if we invite the listeners that are with us here to send us messages about ways that they take that pause. Is it meditating? Is it journaling? Is it looking at the tree leaves? I don't know. What is it? What do you do to have that pause and to that connection to nature, environment, and yourself? And that's where it's
Hmm.
really important to have that connection with yourself, to be able to really hone in on these skills that are intuition, that by
Hmm.
every appearance, anything I've looked at, every single one of us has. Many of us have pushed it aside. Many of us don't know how to identify it. And it can be such a huge tool in our lives to be able to
Hmm.
look at what our intuition is saying. And
Hmm.
again, sometimes we know what it's saying, sometimes we don't. And and it's okay. I feel like that's where trust gets built, is if
Yeah.
I follow a moment of intuition and I have no idea what could have happened. That's me getting to trust me.
Yeah.
And wherever that
Yeah.
source is, it's trusting that because I did what I did, that teeny little thing or that catastrophic thing didn't happen, or
Hmm.
did happen. We don't know. And
Hmm.
and I'm okay with that because I trust the universe. basically, is what it
Right.
boils down to for me.
Right.
And by trusting the universe, I can trust myself. And
Yeah.
that's what intuition means to me. Do you have any other thoughts you'd like to share, Crystal?
Um, I had an instance where I did get to see a negative impact of not listening to my intuition, and it was years ago. My son wanted to borrow my car. He was a new driver, and it was my, you know, nice new car. And I said, and I really was reticent about letting him drive it. He was going, on the freeway about 30 miles away. Um, and I said, with, heaviness in my heart, frankly, I said, you can take it if you promise not to crash it. And he was
Mm,
like, I promise, right? And not 5 minutes later, I got a call that he'd been in a 5-car pileup on the
mm,
freeway.
mm,
And the car had accordioned, and he was fine. He was very shaken up, of course. My car was trashed, was totaled. And it was just this like, it was this realization. I had the realization at the time, even of like, I knew if he took the car, this would happen, and I ignored it.
mhm,
And so I guess my parting thought is, you know, trust your guts, man, and don't let it be about stories,
mhm.
right?
Yeah, or even peer pressure,
Or peer pressure.
and
Yeah.
while your son is not your peer, there was still some pressure there to go, "Oh, come on, mom, it'll be
Yeah.
fine."
Well, and he really wanted to go see his girlfriend.
Mhm,
And and looking back, I mean, that was a shit show relationship anyway. And then had I known what their relationship was, I would have definitely said no. But
mhm.
anyway, yeah, it's just, yeah, just trust your gut. I'm sorry, listeners, that I tend to ramble like that. It's just the way my weird brain works. But trust your gut is my final answer. My final answer. It's not my final answer. It's my final thought.
The Jeopardy show is now over. All right. Well, thanks, Crystal. This was fun. And we'll talk again soon. And
All
listeners,
right.
we'd love to have you do all the things:
Yes.
subscribe, share,
Email
comment.
us. Give us
Yes.
ideas. Give us feedback. Um, we really, really want to hear from you.
Okay. We'd love to hear from our listeners. To leave a comment, share a story, or ask a question, email us at listeners@mysticdetectives.com. You can also find out about our Patreon and other interesting things going on at our website, mysticdetectives.com. As always, we invite you to subscribe, share, and leave reviews to support the podcast. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Stay curious.
And keep exploring.